In just 60 seconds, J.D. Vance shocked the nation. Before tens of thousands gathered at the Army's 250th anniversary parade, his chilling words cut through the night. Words so bold, so unexpected, that Congress fell silent. It happened during one of the most dangerous moments in decades, an Iran-Israel crisis that had America holding its breath. The cameras captured his stare, his steady voice, his challenge to the powerful. And as his speech echoed across the country, millions asked the same question. What did J.D. Vance say that no one dared before? And why does it still haunt Washington today? This is a story shaped by history's echoes, drawn from the real anxieties and hopes that live in all of us. Though dramatized, every emotion, every conflict, every question you'll encounter is meant to reflect the truth we face when the stakes could not be higher. So lean in, listen closely, and ask yourself, was this the courage America needed, or the warning we failed to heed? Stay with us. This is more than a story. It's a moment to remember who we are and what we stand for. Washington, D.C. had seen countless parades, countless speeches, countless nights when flags rippled and cameras flashed. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, something heavy, electric. The city seemed to hold its breath. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, banners snapped in the cool evening breeze, their stars and stripes glowing gold beneath the floodlights. Rows upon rows of flags lined the National Mall, each one standing like a silent sentinel, as if the city itself knew that this night could mark a turning point. People filled every space, veterans with proud, worn faces, families clutching small paper flags, their children hoisted on shoulders, uniformed officers standing rigid and alert, reporters adjusting their microphones, whispering into their earpieces. The air buzzed not with celebration, but with waiting, with tension. Above it all, the dome of the Capitol gleamed white against a darkening sky, a reminder of the promise of democracy and the weight of decisions made inside. And beneath that dome, whispers spread like wildfire. What will J.D. say? Will he play it safe, or will he do the unthinkable? God help us if he goes too far tonight. The Iran-Israel crisis had dragged the world to the edge of its seat. Every headline, every broadcast warned of escalation, of lines crossed, of a spark that could set the world ablaze. And now America's Vice President, J.D. Vance, would take the stage at the Army's 250th anniversary, in front of soldiers ready to serve, lawmakers ready to react, and a nation desperate for clarity. Camera flashes lit up faces, not just of the powerful seated near the stage, but of the ordinary people who had come from all corners of the country to see history unfold. The hum of live feeds filled the night, networks broadcasting coast to coast, as if everyone watching understood that this speech might echo far beyond the mall. J.D. Vance. His name was on every tongue tonight, the boy from Middletown, Ohio, the man who'd risen from a town forgotten by steel, by jobs, by promises made and broken. The man who spoke plainly, sometimes too plainly, for the comfort of Washington elites. Some in the crowd expected another polished, cautious address, words carefully chosen, designed not to offend, not to stir too much, a ceremonial nod to soldier sacrifice, a safe speech for dangerous times. But many came hoping for more, for something real, for the voice of the J.D. Vance who had, more than once, said what no one else dared. They watched the stage, eyes narrowed, hearts tight with anticipation. What would he say tonight? Would he call for unity or stir the embers of fear? Would his words steady a nation on edge or push it closer to the brink? The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of fireworks prepared for later in the night, and something else, the restless energy of a city waiting for its cue. The weight of unsaid words seemed to press down on the parade grounds. Even the children fell quiet, as if they too sensed that what was coming would not be easily forgotten. The elite seated in the front rows leaned toward one another, sharing quick, nervous glances. The cameras swung toward the podium, focusing on the empty microphone. The people, the ones who had driven through the night, who had stood for hours to claim a spot, who had come not just to see a man, but to hear a truth. They waited, breath held, hope and dread mingling in their chests. And somewhere in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the stage lights, J.D. Vance stood still for a heartbeat longer. His hand brushed the small steel pin on his lapel, a reminder of where he came from and who he spoke for. He stepped forward, and the city waited, silent, on the edge of history. And while the city waited in that charged, breathless silence, somewhere behind the grand stage, J.D. Vance stood alone in a quiet room, the roar of the crowd now muffled by thick walls and the hum of history pressing in. His reflection stared back at him from the tall window. A man in a crisp suit, polished shoes, the Vice President of the United States. But that wasn't the man he saw. Not really. His fingers found their way, almost by instinct, to the small steel pin fastened to his lapel. Cool to the touch, solid, unbending. A gift from his grandfather, who had worked the mills until his hands were calloused, until steel dust lined the cracks of his palms. J.D. rubbed his thumb across its surface, feeling the weight of it, the truth of it. That pin had come from a scrap of steel salvaged the day the mill closed, the day the town lost its heart. To J.D., it wasn't just a pin, it was a promise he'd made to himself long ago. And tonight that promise would be tested. Outside, the Capitol dome glowed under the floodlights, a beacon of democracy, or, as J.D. sometimes thought, a mirror reflecting the hopes and failures of a nation still searching for itself. His eyes lingered on it, and slowly memories rose like smoke from an old fire. He was 10 again, sitting on the crumbling curb of Jackson Street. The sidewalks were cracked, the storefronts boarded up, but that day flags lined the road and the town came alive for the parade. JD could almost hear the brass band now, could see the soldiers in uniform marching by, the pride in his grandfather's eyes as they passed. He could feel the grit of the curb under his hands, the heat of the sun on his neck. Back then, J.D. had believed the parade was for them, for his town, for the men who bent steel and built America with their bare hands. But as he grew, he saw how quickly that pride faded once the last note was played, once the last flag was folded. He saw how his town was forgotten, how promises made beneath that same Capitol dome were broken again and again. And now here he was, on the other side of the glass, about to step onto a stage where so many expected him to give the kind of speech that filled headlines but changed nothing. A speech safe enough to please the powerful, polished enough to keep the markets calm, careful enough to say much and mean little. His reflection seemed to challenge him. J.D. drew a slow breath, steadying himself. The words formed in his mind, clear and heavy. They'll expect another polished speech, but that's not what they deserve tonight. The murmur of the crowd outside swelled, a reminder that the city was still waiting, still watching. J.D. let his hand fall from the pin and turned toward the door. The steel beneath his fingers had done its job. It had reminded him of who he was, of where he came from, and of the people he spoke for. And as he stepped out into the corridor, leaving the quiet behind, the tension of the night met him like a wave. The transition from stillness to anticipation was seamless, as if the city's heartbeat and his own now beat in time. The lights of the stage called him forward, and with one final breath, J.D. Vance began his walk toward history. The corridor stretched ahead of him, lights glowing softly along its length, the muffled sounds of the waiting crowd growing louder with each step. J.D. Vance moved with purpose now, his heart steady, his mind clear, as if the weight of the steel pin in his lapel anchored him to what mattered most. The quiet of the room he had just left clung to him for a moment longer, before it was swept away by the roar of voices as he emerged into the floodlights of the stage. The night air hit him first. Cool, sharp, alive with the energy of tens of thousands gathered on the National Mall. A sea of faces stretched before him, soldiers in dress uniform, veterans with their medals pinned proudly, families with children perched on shoulders, their small hands waving flags that caught the glow of the stage lights. Beyond them, the press stood ready, cameras already whirring and flashing, eager to catch the first frame that would define the night. The Capitol dome loomed behind, a silent witness to all that was about to unfold. Music swelled from the band at the edge of the platform, a triumphant anthem meant to stir pride, to mark tradition. The crowd cheered as if on cue, their voices rising like a wave toward the stage. The air crackled with expectation. This was the moment so many had waited for, a speech at once ceremonial and symbolic, the kind that would be replayed on screens across the country before the night was over. JD stepped forward, his shoes firm against the polished wood beneath him, his gaze sweeping the crowd not as a politician scanning for applause, but as a man seeking faces, real faces, to remind him of why he was here. The cheers rang in his ears, but already he felt the distance between what was expected and what he had come to say. He reached the microphone, its silver head gleaming under the spotlights, and paused. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand. The gesture was simple, but the effect was immediate. The music faltered, then stopped. The cheers softened, then fell away. A hush spread over the crowd, rolling outward like a tide pulling back from shore. In that silence, the weight of the moment settled upon them all, a breath held by a city, a nation, on edge. JD's voice, when it came, was low, steady, and carried across the mall with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. His first words were not what they had rehearsed, not what anyone had written on the teleprompters waiting at his sides. "If you care more about politics than our soldiers," he said, each syllable sharp as steel, "leave this hall now." The gasp was almost a single sound, as if drawn from thousands of lungs at once. The ripple of shock moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. A mother in the front row, her son's photograph pinned to her jacket, gripped her flag tighter, her knuckles white against the wood of the pole. A senator seated among the dignitaries shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward his colleagues, as if seeking confirmation that he had truly heard what he thought he'd heard. JD let the words hang in the air, refusing to fill the silence that followed with anything but their echo. He scanned the faces before him, seeing their surprise, their confusion, and, in some, the flicker of understanding that perhaps tonight would not be like other nights. The cameras zoomed in, their lenses hungry for the image that would define the headlines come morning. The vice president, defiant, unflinching, challenging the very room he stood in. And yet, beneath the tension, beneath the shock, there was a current that JD could feel. A shift, subtle but certain, a readiness, a willingness, perhaps, to hear what came next. The breeze stirred again, carrying with it the weight of history, the sense that this moment might live far beyond the mall, beyond the night. The silence remained, deep, waiting, as JD prepared to speak again, knowing that with each word there would be no turning back. The silence that followed JD Vance's first words felt almost sacred, as if the city itself leaned in to listen. He stood steady at the microphone, feeling the weight of those watching, not just in the mall, but across living rooms, offices, and stations throughout the country. His gaze swept across the rows of faces before him, soldiers, veterans, families, officials, and in that instant, his mind was filled not with their titles or their uniforms, but with memories of the individuals who had taught him what true courage looked like. JD's voice was measured, but beneath the surface, a current of emotion began to rise. "I've seen courage," he began, his tone softening, drawing the audience closer. "I've seen it in the faces of men and women who asked nothing for themselves and gave everything for the rest of us." He paused, and the night seemed to grow stiller, the flags behind him stirring gently in the breeze. His mind's eye brought forward the image of a Marine he'd met in a small town in Kentucky. The man had lost a leg to an IED, but there he'd been, hammer in hand, sweat pouring down his brow, rebuilding a neighbor's porch after a storm tore it apart. Not for pay, not for thanks, just because that's what neighbors do. And then the memory of the Air Force pilot, a mother of two, came to him. He'd met her quietly away from the cameras in a VA parking lot. She'd been sleeping in her car between hospital shifts and flight training because rent near the base had climbed beyond what she could manage. Still, when she spoke of her service, there was no bitterness in her voice, only pride, only determination to keep going. JD felt his throat tighten as the images played in his mind. His fingers brushed once more against the steel pin at his lapel, grounding him. The words that came next did not come from his speechwriters or from any prepared text. They came from a place deeper, truer. His voice cracked slightly, just enough for the audience to hear the cost of memory, the cost of honesty. They don't ask for praise, he said, letting the words settle like truth between them. They ask for dignity. The effect was immediate. In the crowd, faces changed. A young private lowered his eyes, humbled by the weight of those words. A mother clutched the dog tag she wore beneath her scarf. A father, resting a hand on his son's shoulder, stood taller, as if to pass on the lesson being spoken aloud. JD let the silence that followed work its way through the gathering. He wanted them to feel it, the quiet strength of those who serve, the invisible load they carry long after the flags are folded and the bands fall silent. He wanted those listening at home, wherever they were, to see in their minds the faces he had seen and to ask themselves whether they had done enough to honor that dignity. And as he stood there, the stage lights casting long shadows across the platform, JD knew that this was only the beginning. He could feel it in the air. A shift, a readiness, as if the crowd, the nation, was waiting not for platitudes but for something real, something that might, if only for a moment, bridge the distance between politics and principle. The quiet of the mall pressed in again, but it was no longer the hush of shock. It was the hush of reflection, of a people reminded of what mattered most. JD drew a slow breath, steadying himself once more, ready to carry that truth forward into what came next. The hush that followed JD's last words lingered, as if the mall itself were holding its breath. He could see it in their faces, the private with his eyes lowered in respect, the mother clutching those dog tags, the families who had come hoping for more than ceremony. And he knew the time had come to speak the truth that weighed on him most. He shifted his gaze beyond the crowd, beyond the rows of soldiers and families, to the far balconies where the powerful sat. Senators, cabinet members, men and women in tailored suits, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of concern, of dignity, of attention. But JD saw what lay beneath. They don't just ask for dignity, he said, his voice steady now, carrying across the mall. They ask not to be forgotten. And yet, how many of us have turned away from that simple request? His eyes returned to the crowd, sweeping over them, as if inviting them to look back with him, to see what he saw, to remember what so many tried not to. He spoke of towns where the mills had fallen silent, where steel once roared and sparks once lit the night sky. Towns where those mills now stood hollow, rusted skeletons of an America that had been. He spoke of main streets lined with boarded windows, where shops that had served generations of families now bore for sale signs so weathered no one even bothered to take them down anymore. He described the war memorials, the small stone monuments that listed the names of those who never came home. Names once read at parades, now faded, their letters chipped and forgotten, like the promises made to their families. JD let those images settle over the mall like a fog, not to accuse, not to divide, but to remind. Because those towns, those places, were the homes of the men and women who filled the ranks, who answered when the country called, who bore the cost of decisions made far from their doorsteps. He drew a breath, slow and measured, his eyes returning to those balconies where the powerful watched him now. There he saw them shift, a senator adjusting his cufflink, a defense contractor's smile tightening, a general glancing down at the polished toes of his boots. JD's words had found their mark, and he knew it. Those towns, those families, he continued, they are not just a backdrop for speeches, they are the heart of this country, and if we forget them, we forget ourselves. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd, not applause, not yet, but the shared recognition of a truth too long ignored. A young soldier in the front row nodded, his jaw set. A grandmother near the back wiped at her eyes with the corner of her scarf. The cameras captured it all, but JD wasn't speaking for the cameras. He never had. And as his gaze swept once more from the balconies to the families on the ground, the power of his words settled into the night. The mall seemed smaller now, closer, as if the space between the powerful and the people had narrowed, if only for a moment. The breeze stirred the flags once more, the sound of their fabric snapping in the night air like a reminder. This was not about pageantry or performance. It was about who we remember and who we choose to forget. JD stood silent for a beat, letting the weight of that truth fill the space between them, knowing that what came next would demand even more. But the stage was set. The echoes of the forgotten were no longer so easy to ignore. For a long moment, J.D. Vance let that silence stretch, the images of forgotten towns and rusted memorials still hanging heavy in the night air. He could feel the weight of his own words, the weight of the faces before him, the families, the soldiers, the workers who understood all too well what it meant to be overlooked, left behind. And he knew what had to come next. His voice, when it rose again, carried an edge sharpened by conviction, by years of watching the cost of empty promises fall on those least able to bear them. "I remember something President Trump said," J.D. began, his tone steady but rising with purpose. His eyes once more found those balconies, those rows where lawmakers and officials sat, where polished shoes met polished stone. He said, "Never send our troops where we wouldn't send our own sons." The words hit like a hammer, simple, undeniable, and yet J.D. knew uncomfortable for many who heard them. He saw it in the tightening jaws, the crossed arms, the glances exchanged among those seated in power, and he let them sit with that discomfort. He wanted them to. J.D. paused, his gaze sweeping back to the crowd, to the soldiers standing so still their uniforms barely stirred in the breeze, to the mothers and fathers whose pride in their children was matched only by the fear they carried every day, to the veterans whose eyes told stories no speech could ever capture. He drew a breath, deep and sure, and when he spoke again, his voice rang with clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "Don't you dare," he said, his words crisp as steel. "Don't you dare ask for their sacrifice if you don't understand its price." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Not shock this time, but agreement, recognition. The words spoke to something they all knew in their bones, that too often decisions made in high chambers asked everything of the few, while demanding nothing of those who made them. J.D.'s voice softened, but the intensity of his message only deepened. "If we send them," he continued, gesturing gently toward the soldiers arrayed before him, "if we ask them to bear that burden, it must never be for politics or polls or profits. It must be because there is no other choice, because their sacrifice would protect something greater than any one of us. That is the pledge I make tonight, to them and to you." The breeze lifted again, carrying his words outward across the mall, through the flags that lined its length, into the hearts of those gathered and those watching from afar. J.D. felt the moment settle, not in applause, not yet, but in the shared understanding that what had been said could not be unsaid, that the night had turned, that history had, in some small way, been shaped. His eyes returned one last time to those balconies, to the faces of the powerful. Some looked back at him with unease, a few perhaps with respect, and many with calculation, weighing his words against the balance of politics and power. J.D. met their gaze without flinching, knowing that in this moment his loyalty lay elsewhere, with those on the ground, with those who served, with those whose voices too often went unheard. The mall was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes not from shock, but from reflection, from the recognition of truth spoken plainly. And in that quiet, J.D. Vance stood steady, ready to carry the message forward, knowing that the hardest words had been said and that the rest of the night would build upon the foundation he had just laid. The quiet that held the National Mall in its grip did not last long. Even before J.D. Vance stepped away from the microphone, before the final echoes of his words had faded into the night, the media machine roared to life. In newsrooms across Washington, across the country, producers barked orders, anchors leaned forward, voices rose over the hum of feeds and signals. The first headlines blazed across the lower thirds of screens. Vance breaks protocol at Army Parade. VP defies prepared script, challenges Congress. A speech that shocks the nation. On social media, the clips spread like wildfire. The moment J.D. raised his hand for silence, the sharp clarity of his opening line. "If you care more about politics than our soldiers, leave this hall now." The camera close-ups, the veteran mother clutching her flag, the senator's uncomfortable shift, replayed again and again, slowed down, captioned, dissected. Within minutes, #Vance speech, Hashtag if you care more, and hashtag Army Parade Shock trended nationwide. In studio panels and late-night emergency broadcasts, commentators scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Some spoke with admiration, voices edged with awe. What we witnessed tonight was courage. It was conviction. This is what leadership looks like. Others, their tones sharp, warned of recklessness. This was dangerous, irresponsible. The vice president poured fuel on an already burning fire in the middle of an international crisis. The split was immediate, and it was deep. On one side, those who saw in JD's words the honesty that had been missing for too long, the willingness to say what so many felt. On the other, those who saw a man who had abandoned caution at the worst possible time, risking division at home, escalation abroad. In living rooms across America, families watched the replays in silence, the gravity of the moment sinking in diners and fire stations, in quiet homes where service flags hung in the windows. People debated in hushed voices. Was this the speech that America needed, or the one it feared most? JD, meanwhile, had stepped back from the podium, the lights still hot on his face, the weight of what he had unleashed already pressing in. But even as the storm began to build beyond the mall, inside newsrooms and on screens, he felt no regret. He had said what he came to say, what he believed had to be said, and now the nation would reckon with it. The cameras continued to follow him as he left the stage, their lenses hungry for one more expression, one more sign of what was to come. But JD offered them nothing more. No smile, no wave, no further word. Just the steady, measured stride of a man who had chosen his path and knew the storm would follow. And follow it did. The night filled with analysis, with outrage, with praise, with fear. Phones rang in campaign offices, in congressional suites, in editorial rooms. Statements were drafted, responses planned. Allies and adversaries alike scrambled to position themselves in the aftermath of words that could not be unsaid. But amid the frenzy, amid the noise and spin, one truth remained. J.D. Vance had changed the conversation. The lines of debate had shifted, and as dawn crept closer and the glow of the floodlights gave way to the first pale light of morning, the question echoed from newsroom to living room, from Capitol office to kitchen table. What happens now? The storm outside raged on. The media frenzy, the surging debate, the endless replays of JD's words. But inside the corridors of power, the storm took on a different shape. Here, behind closed doors and beneath high ceilings, the air was thick with tension of another kind. In back rooms, lit by soft lamps and cold monitors, aides clustered in urgent, hushed arguments that felt louder than the noise outside. "He's off message," one hissed, pacing tight circles near a long mahogany table. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, his voice sharp with panic. "This wasn't the speech. This wasn't what we cleared. What is he thinking?" Across from him, another aide, younger, quieter, shook his head, his tone measured but firm. "He spoke the truth, and everyone out there knows it. You can't script moments like this." "But we're in the middle of a crisis," the first snapped back, hands slicing through the air. "He just threw gasoline on it. We're supposed to calm things down, not light matches." Their voices rose, clashing like steel in the small space. Outside, beyond the heavy doors, the hum of the building, the footsteps of staff, the murmur of urgent calls, the ever-present weight of history seemed to press closer, listening. The argument was not theirs alone. It was the argument already unfolding in offices across the Capitol, in green rooms, in committee rooms, in whispered phone calls between those trying to decide whether J.D. Vance had just made history or a grave mistake. And in the middle of it all, J.D. moved quietly down a side hall, his pace steady, his heart still beating to the rhythm of the words he had spoken. The noise, the spin, the clash of opinion. He had expected it. He had braced for it the moment he chose to raise his hand and still the crowd. But even so, the storm's force pressed in on him now, the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. He turned a corner and found her waiting. His wife stood alone near the window, the glow of the city's lights soft on her face. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. J.D. crossed to her, and for a moment, the world beyond those walls, the cameras, the critics, the chaos, fell away. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. "You spoke what's in your heart," she said quietly, the words wrapping around him like shelter. "That's what they'll remember." JD drew a breath, the tightness in his chest easing as her voice steadied him. The certainty in her eyes, the calm she carried even in this storm, reminded him why he had spoken as he did. Not for the headlines, not for the applause or the anger, but for the people who had been waiting for too long for someone to say what needed to be said. Beyond the window, the city sprawled in lights and shadows, a city alive with reaction, with reckoning. Inside, JD and his wife stood together in that quiet moment, two figures against the storm, their hands joined, their resolve shared. And as he stepped back toward the fray, the echoes of aides arguing still faint in the distance, JD knew the course was set. The words were spoken. The storm had begun. And now all that remained was to walk through it, one truth at a time. As JD left that quiet space where his wife's words had steadied him, the storm of the night met him again. Not in the clamor of aides or the chatter of reporters, but in the faces of the people gathered beyond the stage. The mall stretched before him, the lights casting long shadows, the flags rippling softly in the night breeze. And in that vast crowd, a single figure moved. A father JD recognized from a meeting months before. A man who had buried his only son, a Marine, beneath a folded flag, and the promise that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The man rose from his seat without a word, his hands trembling as he straightened his spine. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand in salute. His face, lined by grief and pride in equal measure, caught the stage light just enough for JD to see the glint of tears tracking down his cheeks. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of 1,000 speeches, 1,000 promises. It was the verdict of a man who knew the cost JD had spoken of, and who, in that moment, chose to honor it. The crowd felt the shift. It moved through them like a tide, unseen but unstoppable. Families of veterans, seated together in tight clusters, began to nod quietly, their faces set with a kind of solemn agreement. A mother clutched the hand of her teenage daughter, tears filling her eyes as she watched the father's salute. And then, almost hesitantly, as if breaking the hush might shatter something sacred, someone began to clap. The sound was soft at first, one pair of hands meeting in the night air. Then another joined, and another. Applause building not in a rush, but in waves, as if the crowd needed that extra breath to find its voice. The hall, that vast open space lined with banners and faces and hope, filled with the sound. Not the raucous cheer of celebration, but the rising, rolling acknowledgement of words that had struck true. It was applause laced with emotion, relief, pride, sorrow, perhaps even a kind of release after the tension that had gripped them all since JD's first chilling line. From his place on the stage, JD stood still, his gaze sweeping over them. He didn't smile. He didn't raise a hand to take credit. He simply let the moment belong to them, the families, the soldiers, the ones who had borne the weight of war and sacrifice without fanfare. The cameras caught it all, broadcasting the growing applause to millions watching across the country. In living rooms, in bars, in quiet homes where photos of loved ones in uniform lined the shelves, people leaned closer to their screens, drawn in by the rawness of the moment. And still the applause grew, no longer hesitant now, but sure, steady, wave after wave until it filled the night and seemed to lift the very air. Even some seated among the powerful, those in the balconies, those who had shifted uncomfortably at JD's words, found themselves caught in it, their hands meeting in cautious, measured claps. It was not unanimous. Not everyone joined. There were still faces set in disapproval, arms crossed in resistance, but they were fewer than JD might have expected. The truth, once spoken, had found its mark in more hearts than politics could shield. And as the sound rolled over him, JD felt its meaning settle deep within. This was not victory. This was not the end of the storm. But it was the answer that mattered most. The people's answer, given not in polls or headlines, but in the language that could not be spun. The language of respect, of shared understanding, of a nation remembering, if only for tonight, what it stood for. As the applause finally began to ebb, JD drew a slow breath, steadying himself for what lay ahead. The storm would continue, the debates would rage, but for this moment the verdict was clear, and it was one he would carry with him as the night moved on. The applause that had filled the night air slowly faded, not in a rush, but in a natural ebb, as if the crowd understood that the moment had spoken its piece, and now something else, something deeper, was waiting to be said. JD let the quiet return, let it settle over the mall like a soft blanket, carrying with it the weight of all that had passed between them, the pledge, the challenge, the verdict of the people. And in that quiet he lifted his eyes toward the Capitol, toward the flag that crowned its great dome, illuminated by the spotlights that ringed the night. For a heartbeat, the whole of the city seemed to follow his gaze. The wind caught the flag just then, and it rippled outward, the red and white stripes catching the light, the stars bright against the dark sky. It was more than fabric in that moment. It was memory, sacrifice, promise, all woven together, all borne aloft by the breeze that whispered through the nation's capital. JD let the silence hold a moment longer, then raised his voice once more, his tone firm but filled with the emotion that had carried him through the night. "That flag," he said, and the words carried across the mall, clear and unmistakable, "doesn't wave for the powerful, it waves for those who bleed for it." The impact of his words was immediate. Heads turned upward, faces lifted to follow his gesture, to see the flag anew. What they saw wasn't just a symbol raised high, but a reminder of the cost carried by those who served, by the families who waited, by the communities who sent their best and bravest into harm's way. JD kept his gaze fixed on the flag as it moved in the night air, as the spotlights caught its edges and turned the stars and stripes into something almost luminous. He wanted them all, those gathered on the mall, those watching from far away, to see it as he did, to understand that it was not owned by the powerful, not a banner of politics or privilege, but a standard raised by sacrifice, kept aloft by the blood and sweat of the forgotten. "The flag above that dome," JD continued, his voice steady but charged with conviction, "isn't just for show. It's not a backdrop for speeches. It's a covenant, a promise that those who give all in its name will not be cast aside, will not be remembered only on days like today." A breeze stirred again, stronger this time, and the flag snapped crisply, as if echoing the resolve in JD's voice. The crowd stood still, the weight of the moment pulling them together in shared reflection. Even those in the balconies, the powerful who had shifted uncomfortably at his earlier words, now found themselves caught in the gaze of that flag, reminded of the duty it demanded of them as well. JD let his hand drop slowly, his eyes returning to the faces before him. "It waves for them," he said softly, almost to himself, but the microphones carried the words far and wide. "It always has. It always will." The night held its breath once more, the flag rippling high above them, a symbol reborn for all who had the courage to truly see it. And as JD stood beneath it, he knew that what came next would matter just as much as what had been said, that words had power, but only if they were followed by action. The moment belonged not to him, but to the promise the flag represented, and to the people who kept that promise alive. The flag above the Capitol snapped once more in the breeze, as if to underline JD's final words. The crowd stood transfixed, their eyes still lifted, their hearts still full from the power of the moment. And JD let the quiet linger, let the image of that flag settle in their minds before he spoke again. Not as a vice president now, but as the boy he had once been, standing on cracked sidewalks, dreaming of a day like this. "I didn't always understand what that flag meant," JD began, his voice softening, drawing the crowd closer in spirit if not in space. His gaze drifted not to the balconies now, not to the cameras, but inward, to a memory that had shaped him in ways no office or title ever could. "I remember one day, long ago, in the town where I grew up. The mills still ran then, though just barely. My grandfather had worked a double shift, came home with the steel dust still on his hands, the tired in his eyes. But that day was the parade. He paused, and for a heartbeat the noise of the night seemed to fade, as if the crowd, too, had been transported back with him to a smaller town, a simpler moment where the stakes felt no less real. I remember how he took me by the hand, JD continued, the words flowing with the ease of truth long carried. How we stood at the curb together, watching the soldiers march by. The band played, the flags waved, and I was too young then to see anything beyond the pageantry, the bright uniforms, the shine of the instruments in the sun. But my grandfather, he saw more. The memory played in his mind as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The grit of the curb beneath him, the heat of the summer sun, the weight of his grandfather's hand, firm and steady, and the flag rippling in the breeze as it passed, its colors bright against the clear blue sky. JD drew a slow breath, the emotion of the memory lending strength to his voice. He leaned down to me, JD said, and he told me, that flag, son, isn't just for the generals or the politicians or the folks at the top. That flag is for the ones who do the work, who fight the fights, who build this country one brick, one beam, one shift at a time. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of speech but of shared memory, as if his words had unlocked echoes of their own fathers, grandfathers, mentors, who had spoken similar truths in quieter moments. And I remember, JD went on, his voice steady now, his eyes meeting theirs. I remember looking at that flag, really looking at it for the first time, and I made myself a promise, standing there on that broken sidewalk, with the band playing and the world going by. I promised that one day I'd stand for them, for the ones like my grandfather, who gave everything and asked for nothing but respect. The mall seemed smaller in that instant, as if the distance between the stage and the people had shrunk, as if JD's memory had drawn them all a little closer together. The breeze stirred again, gentle now, carrying with it the scent of summer grass and the quiet resolve of a boy's vow, grown into a man's mission. JD let his words rest there, let the power of the memory do what no speech ever could. And as the night waited for what came next, the crowd, the city, the nation stood with him, remembering, reflecting, and ready to hear more. JD's voice faded into the night, but his words remained, hanging over the mall like a quiet anthem. The memory he had shared, of a boy on a broken sidewalk, of a grandfather's lesson, of a promise made beneath a flag, settled deep in the hearts of those who listened. For a moment it felt as if the crowd held its collective breath, the weight of that promise echoing through them. The flags lining the square stirred in the breeze, their fabrics snapping softly, like the steady drumbeat of history itself. And then, slowly, something began to shift. It started with a single movement, a veteran in the front rows, his uniform jacket faded with age but his posture still proud, rose to his feet. His hand went to his brow in a firm salute, his gaze fixed on JD, but also on the flag that flew above them all. That small gesture seemed to break the spell. A second figure stood, then a third. Veterans first, then civilians, families, workers, officials. Row by row they rose, not with the rushed excitement of a rally, but with the solemn dignity of a people recognizing a truth they could not ignore. The applause began quietly, like the first drops of rain on a still pond. A single pair of hands, then another. Soft at first, as if they feared to disturb the weight of the moment, but the sound grew, spreading outward like ripples, gathering strength with each heartbeat. The veterans clapped, their hands firm, their faces lined with emotion. Parents clapped, holding tight to their children's hands. Young soldiers clapped, their eyes bright, standing taller as they did. And the applause rose until it filled the night, until it shook the square with its force. From his place on the stage, JD stood steady, his heart full not with pride in himself, but with gratitude for what he saw before him. This was not applause for politics, not applause for a party or a platform. This was something pure. This was respect given freely, earned not by position but by truth. For a fleeting, precious moment, the usual divisions that mark such gatherings, the lines between left and right, between powerful and ordinary, between polished and plain, seemed to blur, to fade, to disappear entirely beneath the shared weight of the promise that flag represented. Cameras captured it all, broadcasting the moment across the nation. But even the cameras seemed secondary now, as if the reality of what was happening could not be fully captured in pixels and sound bites. What mattered was what the people felt, the quiet pride, the shared recognition, the sense that, for tonight at least, they stood together beneath a single flag, bound by the same memory, the same hope. In the balconies, even those who had shifted uncomfortably at JD's earlier words found themselves drawn into the rising tide. Some clapped cautiously at first, then with more conviction. A few remained seated, arms crossed, faces tight with calculation. But they were the exception now, their silence drowned in the swell of applause that rolled through the mall like a wave. JD let the applause wash over him, let it belong to the people who had made it. He raised no hand to claim it, offered no gesture to command it. This was not his moment. It was theirs. It was the moment of the veteran who had risen first, the moment of the grandfather who had given a lesson on a parade day long ago, the moment of every soldier and worker and family who kept the promise of that flag alive. And as the applause finally began to ebb, as the night settled once more into a waiting hush, JD drew a breath, knowing that the work was far from done. But for now, for this moment beyond politics, they had remembered together what it meant to stand as one. The applause that had filled the night air eventually faded, but its echo lingered in the hearts of those who had stood, who had clapped, who had felt for a moment what it meant to be one nation under a single flag. JD stepped from the stage in that quiet aftermath, knowing the storm was far from over. The people had spoken with their hands, with their hearts, but now the other voices would rise, louder, sharper, less forgiving. By dawn, those voices filled the airwaves. The Capitol, which had stood in respectful silence through the night, erupted into the familiar chorus of condemnation and defense. Behind closed doors, in committee rooms and press conferences hastily arranged, members of Congress spoke in clipped, controlled tones that masked their fury. This was dangerous rhetoric, one senior senator declared, his face tight with anger during a morning interview. The vice president overstepped. He turned what should have been a unifying event into a political spectacle at a time of international crisis. Reckless doesn't begin to describe it. Another, equally polished, echoed the charge. When the world is watching, we need stability, not provocation, not words that might be misread by friend or foe alike. The editorials came next. Headlines typed at speed, columns rushed to print before the ink was dry on the morning papers. Vance's gamble, bravery or blunder. A statesman's duty is to soothe, not to stir. When words become weapons, the risk of Vance's Army parade speech. JD's face was everywhere, splashed across newspaper front pages, filling television screens, trending online as clips of his speech replayed on loop. In one city, his image was paired with the word hero. In another, with the word threat. The man who had drawn applause from a divided crowd now found himself a symbol of division in the halls of power. The same commentators who had praised his plain-spoken courage just hours before now questioned his judgment. The same networks that had marveled at the standing ovation now debated whether the cost of his words was too high, whether the risks he had stirred outweighed the truth he had spoken. Inside the Capitol, the lines hardened. Some lawmakers, those who had long distrusted JD's refusal to play by the usual rules, seized the moment to call for censure, for investigation, for some means of reining him in. Others, quietly but firmly, defended him. They spoke of the people's applause, of the truth that had resonated beyond party, beyond politics. But theirs was a smaller chorus, harder to hear over the roar of outrage. And yet, for all the condemnation, for all the fury and debate, JD moved through the morning unchanged. The storm he had expected had come. The storm he had braced for was here. But he carried with him the memory of the faces in the crowd, of the veterans' salute, of the flag lifting high above the Capitol in the night breeze. As the city argued, as the nation debated, JD Vance remained steady, knowing that history would decide in time whether his words had been recklessness or the courage the moment demanded. And as he prepared for what came next, he knew one thing above all. The voices of power would rage for days, but it was the voices of the people, the quiet, steady ones, that would endure. The Capitol's fury echoed through the morning, filling headlines, airwaves, and marble hallways. But while lawmakers debated, while commentators dissected and analysts speculated, J.D. Vance found his way to a different place. A place where words like hero and threat held little meaning, where the cost of decisions was measured not in polls or sound bites, but in scars and sacrifice. Long before the city stirred fully to life, J.D. arrived at the VA hospital on the edge of the Capitol, his car pulling up quietly, no motorcade, no press trailing in his wake. The dawn's first light had not yet broken over the horizon, and the building stood still in the gray of morning. Inside, the halls were hushed, the air thick with the kind of stillness that comes after long nights of pain and perseverance. J.D. walked those halls alone, his steps measured, his heart heavy but certain. There were no cameras here, no staff called in early to arrange photo opportunities, no speeches prepared or statements waiting to be read. This was not a visit meant for headlines. This was a visit meant for them, the ones who had given so much and asked so little in return. He entered a small room where a young soldier sat, his wheelchair positioned near the window, where the faintest light of morning began to seep in. The soldier's uniform jacket hung on the chair's back, its patches worn, its colors faded. His hands rested on his knees, and as J.D. stepped closer, those hands reached out, strong despite all they had endured. The soldier gripped J.D.'s hand with a firmness that spoke more than any words might have. His eyes met J.D.'s, clear and steady, and in that gaze was all the truth J.D. needed. "You said what we feel but can't say," the soldier told him, his voice low but filled with quiet conviction. J.D. felt the weight of that simple statement settle deep in his chest. He gave the soldier's hand a squeeze in return, not as a politician offering thanks, but as a man sharing the bond of those who understand sacrifice, of those who honor it not with ceremony, but with presence. He stayed long past what his aides might have planned, had they known where he had gone. The hours slipped by as he moved from room to room, listening more than speaking, letting the stories of those who bore the true cost of service fill the space between them. They spoke of battlefields and homecomings, of nights haunted by memory and days fueled by the will to carry on. They spoke of the comrades they had lost and the promises they hoped their country would keep. J.D. made no promises that morning. He offered no grand solutions or sweeping declarations. Instead, he offered what he knew mattered most: time, attention, the quiet respect of a man who understood that listening, truly listening, was its own kind of service. As the sun finally rose, casting gold across the city that still debated his name, J.D. stepped out of the hospital, the noise of the Capitol distant now, softened by the truths he had heard. The storm would rage on, he knew. The critics would continue. But here, in these halls, he had found the answer that mattered, the reason he had spoken, the reason he would speak again. And as he stood for a moment in the dawn's light, J.D. Vance carried their stories with him, steady, unshaken, ready for what came next. The quiet of the hospital halls still echoed in J.D.'s mind long after he had left them behind. The sun had risen, climbed, and set again, casting long shadows across the Capitol's marble steps, where the debates and denunciations continued without pause. Statements were issued, interviews given, opinions volleyed like cannon fire across the networks. But J.D. stayed largely silent, his time spent in reflection, in listening, in steady resolve. It was late when the call came, late enough that the city had at last begun to rest, the endless news cycles pausing for breath, the bright lights of the studios dimmed for the night. J.D. sat alone in his study, the steel pin from his lapel resting on the desk before him, a reminder of where he'd started, of who he spoke for. The ring of the phone broke the stillness. Not the official line, not the staff's screen calls. This one came direct. He picked up, knowing before he did who it would be. The voice on the other end was familiar, steady, carrying the weight of someone who understood what it meant to stand alone beneath a storm. "You said what needed saying," came Trump's voice. No preamble, no small talk, just the blunt force of shared recognition. J.D. let the words settle, the simplicity of them carrying more meaning than any formal praise. He leaned forward slightly, his hand resting near the pin on the desk. His reply came as easily, as honestly as the speech that had started it all. "I said what I believe," JD answered. "I'll never do less." There was a pause on the other end, but not the awkward kind. The kind that comes when two men understand one another without needing to fill the space between them. Then Trump's voice again, quieter this time but no less certain. "They'll come after you for it. You know that. They already are." JD allowed himself a faint smile, not of amusement, but of resolve. "Let them," he said simply. Outside, beyond the tall windows of his study, the flag atop the Capitol caught the night breeze, visible even in the darkness, its stripes faintly lit by the city's glow. JD's gaze found it, the symbol he had pointed to before the nation, the promise he had spoken of now as clear to him as it had been that night on Jackson Street so many years ago. "They won't forget this," Trump added after another beat of quiet. "You've drawn a line, JD, and once it's drawn, you can't step back from it." JD's voice was steady, the words as sure as any he'd spoken on that stage. "I didn't come this far to step back." The conversation went on, not long, not filled with strategy or spin, just the exchange of two men who understood the price of conviction. When the call ended, JD sat for a while longer, the quiet of the night wrapping around him, the city resting at last beneath the flag that waved for those who had given all. He thought of the soldier's grip in the hospital, the father's salute on the mall, the stories shared in rooms where cameras never reached. He thought of the storm that would rage again come morning, of the voices that would rise to praise or condemn. But in that moment, beneath the flag's watchful presence, JD Vance felt no uncertainty, no regret. He had spoken his truth, and whatever came next, he would meet it the only way he knew how, with steady steps, with clear purpose, with the promise he had made so long ago still lighting his way. The storm of headlines, the roar of pundits, the clash of voices in Washington, they filled the air in the days after JD's speech. But when the cameras dimmed, when the microphones fell silent, when the city slept at last, something else began to fill the space around JD Vance, the voices that truly mattered. It began with a single envelope, slipped quietly into his mail. A letter written in a hand rough from work, the words plain but heavy with meaning. A widow from Pennsylvania, who had buried her husband beneath a flag, thanked him for speaking the words she'd carried in her heart, but never dared to say aloud. You reminded them who he was, what he gave. You reminded them of us. Then came another and another. Letters from veterans who had felt invisible, who now felt seen. From steelworkers in shuttered towns who heard in JD's voice the echo of their own forgotten promises. From parents who had watched their sons and daughters leave for distant shores, uncertain if they would return, and who now felt someone in power finally understood the weight they bore. JD read each letter, sometimes late into the night, his study lamp casting soft light across the piles of envelopes. He read them not as a man looking for praise, but as a man seeking reassurance that the truth had found its mark. And in each line, in each story shared, he found what he had hoped for, not approval, but connection. One letter, smaller than the rest, written in a child's careful print, he folded and slipped into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his heart. It came from a boy in West Virginia, the son of a veteran who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan. The boy wrote simply, "Thank you for seeing my dad." That letter became his constant companion, the reminder he carried with him as the storm continued to swirl around him. The Capitol debated, the media dissected. But in the quiet moments, JD Vance listened to the voices of home and knew he had done what needed to be done. At first, the storm seemed unrelenting. The critics loud, the headlines sharp, the talking points relentless. But truth once spoken has a way of finding its place, of growing roots even in the most hardened ground. And slowly, quietly, the shift began. It started with letters to the editor, calls to radio shows, comments that broke through the noise of partisanship. He said what we all feel. About time someone remembered the ones who serve. Even those who had first condemned the speech found themselves listening anew as the voices of ordinary Americans rose above the din. A respected retired general, long considered a careful, cautious voice, appeared on a major network's panel. The host asked the question everyone was debating. Was J.D. Vance reckless or brave? The general answered without hesitation. It was a necessary shock, he said. We've forgotten what it means to bear responsibility for the lives we asked to fight our battles. He reminded us. The words landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples through the conversation. Opinion pieces that had once called for censure softened their tone. Commentators who had dismissed J.D. as divisive now spoke of him as daring. And beyond the capital, in the towns and cities where families hung service flags in their windows, the tide turned faster still. Where once J.D.'s face on a screen sparked debate, now it sparked pride. Where once his name in a headline stirred outrage, now it stirred reflection. His speech, his truth, had taken root, and no amount of spin or fury could tear it free. The invitation came as J.D. knew it would. A primetime interview, national audience, no script, no safety net. His team advised caution. Some urged him to decline, but J.D. accepted without hesitation. This was not the time to hide. The studio lights were bright, the set polished and cold. The interviewer, a veteran of high-profile conversations, welcomed him with a handshake that was firm but curious, as if even she wasn't sure what to expect. The cameras rolled. The world watched. From the first question, it was clear this would not be a soft exchange. Vice President Vance, she began, her tone measured. Many have called your speech at the Army parade reckless. They say you risked inflaming tensions, undermining diplomacy. Do you regret what you said? J.D. met her gaze steady and unflinching. I don't regret a single word, he said, because every word was true. The questions came fast, pointed, probing. Did he consider the political fallout? Did he worry about the message it sent abroad? Did he fear what it might cost him? J.D. answered each with the same calm certainty, his voice clear, his meaning plain. As long as I breathe, he said near the end, I will fight for the forgotten, for the ones who bear the cost, who carry the burden, who give this country more than it ever gives them back. I spoke for them, and I'll speak for them again, no matter the cost. For a moment, the studio fell silent. The interviewer caught between her next question and the weight of his answer. She searched for words but found none that could follow, and at last, with a quiet nod, she said simply, Thank you for your honesty. The interview ended, but the moment lived on. Clips spread across networks and feeds, shared not for controversy now, but for clarity, for courage, for the reminder that sometimes the hardest truth is the one most worth saying. J.D. Vance left the studio that night not with cheers, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty that his promise still held, and that the line he had drawn would not fade with the news cycle, but would mark the path ahead. The night was quiet as J.D. Vance left the studio and made his way through the city, choosing to walk rather than ride, drawn by the stillness that settled over Washington once the cameras dimmed and the voices fell silent. The air was cool, the streets mostly empty, save for the soft hum of traffic in the distance and the occasional flicker of a street lamp casting pools of gold on the pavement. J.D. walked with his hands in his pockets, the letter from the boy in West Virginia folded carefully against his heart, the memory of the night's words and the weight of their meaning heavy in his mind. The monuments rose around him, familiar and imposing. The Lincoln Memorial standing sentinel, the Washington Monument piercing the dark sky, the Capitol's dome glowing faintly in the distance. But tonight they felt different, less like stone and more like memory, like markers of the promises and struggles that had shaped the nation. Reminders of the quiet courage that had built and rebuilt America time and again. Each step J.D. took seemed to echo with the footsteps of those who had walked before him. Men and women who had spoken hard truths, borne heavy burdens, and known that the cost of honesty was always high. As he neared the Capitol, J.D. paused, looking up at the flag that rippled softly in the night breeze. And in that quiet moment, with the city at rest and the storm of politics briefly stilled, he reflected not on what his words might cost him, but on what they might give, not to him, but to those who needed them most. Far from Washington, in a small house on the edge of an Ohio town J.D. knew well, The glow of a television lit a darkened living room. A boy no older than JD had been the day he stood on that cracked sidewalk beside his grandfather, sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide as he watched the replay of the speech that had stirred a nation. His mother stood in the doorway, watching him more than the screen, seeing the way he leaned forward, the way the words seemed to light something inside him that no lesson or lecture ever could. The boy listened as JD spoke of service, of sacrifice, of standing for the ones forgotten by power. He watched the faces in the crowd, saw the veterans rise, heard the applause that had filled the night air. And when the clip ended, when the final words faded into quiet, he turned to his mother, his voice soft but certain. "I want to be like him," he said. His mother's eyes glistened in the glow of the screen, her heart full with pride and hope. She reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder, feeling the truth of what he just said settle into the room, into the future that waited ahead. The boy didn't look away from the screen, even as it dimmed to black. His gaze stayed steady, his mind already dreaming of what it might mean to stand, to serve, to speak for those who could not. And somewhere beyond that small house, beyond that quiet town, the spark of a new promise was lit, a seed of service planted in soil long prepared by the courage of others. The first light of dawn crept over the Capitol, casting soft gold across its steps, washing the marble in the quiet promise of a new day. JD Vance stood there, alone, as the city slowly stirred to life behind him. The air was cool, the sky streaked with pale pink and silver, and above him the flag flew high, its colors bright against the morning light, lifted by a breeze that carried the weight of history and hope alike. JD looked up at that flag, at the symbol he had spoken of, fought for, stood beneath when the storm of criticism had raged strongest. And in that quiet hour, with the city not yet fully awake, he felt the same clarity that had guided him through the night's hardest moments. The letter from the veteran's son was still in his pocket, its simple words as steadying as the steel pin that remained fastened at his lapel. He drew a breath, deep and sure, and in the hush of the morning, whispered words that were not meant for cameras or crowds, but for himself, for the flag, for those he had promised to stand for. "This is who I fight for," JD said, his voice barely above the breeze. "This is who I'll always fight for." And as the city awoke and the day began, JD remained there a moment longer, letting the flag's movement match the steady rhythm of his heart, knowing the path ahead would not be easy, but certain that the promise made beneath its folds would guide his steps, today, tomorrow, and for as long as the stand was needed. This story reminds us that true leadership is not about power or position, but about courage. The courage to speak for those who have no voice and to stand firm when the world pushes back. JD Vance's journey shows how honesty, even when costly, can light a path for others. It's a quiet victory that lives in hearts, not headlines. What do you believe makes someone worthy of standing beneath the flag? And how can we each honor that in our daily lives? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.